Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Sifu, T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 99. This is the final episode on the secret societies and organized crime as they're associated with the Chinese martial arts. We're going to be taking a close look into the Axe Gang, Lao Bun, Bruce Lee, Choli Foot, Mantis, Tibetan Lama, or Hopgar Kung Fu, and much more. But before I do, I often take time during this program to sometimes point out what might be considered a fake or a charlatan of some kind, like some guy who's on TV showboating that he's a secret master of some kind and how he can break bricks and do all these tricks, up until the point where the news anchor, who's just kind of showing the crowd that these bricks are real because he actually believes that they are, and he touches one with his little index finger and the thing crumbles right there in front of him, and he can't stop laughing. That's what we normally do here, but I'm not doing that today. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the story of a young man who actually demonstrates magnificent martial courage and skill, some of the very things we talk about, and he does it real time. The story I found comes from masslive.com, and it was posted in 2014, and it's titled, Springfield Teen Uses Martial Arts Training to Defend Child from Bully. The article says that the 16-year-old Roman Rodriguez walked out of his martial arts class on a Monday, and upon leaving the building, Rodriguez saw a group of approximately 8 teenagers huddled around a younger child. Realizing what was going on, because he had experience on what it was like to be bullied, Rodriguez approached the group. Then Roman Rodriguez said, quote, "When I saw the situation, it immediately bothered me. I saw he was crying," end quote. So as he walked toward the group, Rodriguez asked the main aggressor to leave the younger child alone by saying, "I don't want any trouble. I just want to walk him home." Rodriguez said that this apparently provoked the bully. Now this bully was a little younger than Rodriguez, but was much larger. The report says that the bully was approximately 6 foot tall, 220 pounds. And when the bully attempted to hit Rodriguez, it was Rodriguez's martial arts training that helped him remain calm. Rodriguez, who had earned his purple belt, said, quote, "He's a lot bigger than me, so I only knocked him down and restrained him. I wanted to avoid things getting worse," end quote. The bully ran home with his group of friends following him. But it was what happened next that really bothered Rodriguez. As the bully ran away, he began yelling that he was going to either stab or shoot Roman. So Rodriguez went back inside of the building to tell his dad what had happened, and his dad said, quote, "My son is a pretty mellow kid, and I could tell something was wrong as he was pretty hyped up," end quote. Now, as father and son walked out together, what they saw was that the bully teenager had returned holding a large kitchen knife with his mother by his side. Now, on a personal note, it's hard for me to use the term mother in this context. A mother, or even a father for that matter, is much more than having the title of having an offspring. Much like martial arts to me is much more than learning the techniques of fighting. We can teach monkeys how to fight, but being a mom and you're escorting your son down the street with garnishing a knife, I don't see that as being a mom. But anyway, back to the story. Rodriguez's father said, quote, "I witnessed this kid's mother encourage her son to stab mine. My first reaction was to protect my son, but also to avoid any kind of tragedy," end quote. Within minutes, the officers of the police department were on the scene. The 14-year-old bully was charged with assault with a dangerous weapon, and the mother was charged with disorderly conduct. The best part of the day came a little later, when an 11-year-old boy who had witnessed the incident gave Roman Rodriguez a certificate of recognition to thank him. This young man demonstrated more than just fighting skills against a larger enemy. He demonstrated a huge amount of courage walking into a situation where he was outnumbered. And something else that he had here that we like to talk about a lot is he had an objective before he went in. He had his objective to get the boy home, to protect him as best as he could, and he executed that to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves and not to make a bad situation worse. The said knucklehead in this scene exercised cowardice by first bullying a younger, smaller boy with a gang of friends, then yelling threats as he ran home with his tail between his legs to Mommy, and then returned with this so-called Mommy carrying a kitchen knife with her as the cheerleader. After I saw the story, I couldn't help but share it as part of the precursor for episode number 99. Now, before I get into the meat of the program, remember that you can support Kung Fu Podcast and everything about this program by going to kungfupodcast.com/support. Every dollar you chip in helps me dedicate time, purchase resources so that I can do the kind of work and research that you all like to see me do. You can also support by just telling a friend or leaving an honest review over on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to the program. And mention the program Kung Fu Podcast in your social media. Now let's get ready to go into the meat of the program. Another example of these martial arts backgrounds and being interwoven into these secret societies and gangs and tongs and things like that, as you may have heard me mention in the previous podcast, number 97, hatchet men. And this was another example of what was the real life, the Axe Gang. The Axe Gang had control over Shanghai, and they used hatchets and axes as the weapons of their choice. They would usually dress in black suits and sometimes top hats. You would see them actually being portrayed in movies such as Boxer from Shantung, which may have been the gang's earliest appearance in cinema. But they also appeared in Drunken Master 2, Marrying the Mafia 2, Kung Fu Hustle, and Shanghai Affairs. So going from the Asian continent to the North American continent and becoming so recognized that they're even portrayed in movies, but they're still part of this underlying secret society that is working through these communities. Perhaps the most significant Tong Wars cultural moment came in 1932 with the release of the film The Hatchet Man. And this film stars Edward Robertson, who plays the role of an assassin and ends up raising his best friend's daughter. The book, Hatchet Men, The Untold Stories of the Tong Wars in San Francisco, is one of the published documents that I actually used and referenced to create this podcast. Also, an interesting reference to this film is by another one of Kung Fu Podcast Agents of Action, Dr. Paul Bowman, and in his book, Theorizing Bruce Lee, Film, Fantasy, Fighting, and Philosophy, where he references the 1932 movie Hatchet Man on page 33. And here's what Dr. Bowman wrote, quote, "The martial arts that first appeared in American cinema were in the films of the 1930s, although they became much more common after the 1960s. The Hatchet Man of 1932 depicted parts of the Chinese Tong Wars in San Francisco, whereas other films may occasionally show judo techniques. In general, martial arts in mainstream American, English, and Australian cinema showed only parodies of the practices, lifted out of all the cultural and historical contexts." End quote. Then later, I found a Chinese novel called Gangsters of the City-State, and this is a semi-fiction work which blends kung fu, mixed martial arts, and underground society into real-life Taiwan. It tells of the dealings between criminal gangs and nationalist Secret Service agents during the 1949 retreat. The story begins in 1965 with the death of the leader of the Green Gang, a secret society established in the Qing dynasty. The details are rooted in history, and then, of course, as a good author of fiction would do, he builds off of that. But one of the interesting things is that through the cinema and the novels, that these secret societies and the martial arts was just part of the culture. And one of the core Chinese cultural concepts that the author Seligman came to understand during his living and working in Asia was something called Mianzi, or what we call, or you use the phrase, saving face. While the Tong Wars were on the surface about money, influence, power, and other things, at the heart, it was all about Mianzi, saving face. And that was something that was not understood at all by law enforcement amidst all of this violence. Seligman writes, quote, "Mianzi is a very powerful motivator. It often trumps money. it trumps power. The 4 Tong Wars became wars of face, end quote. So here we are in this time frame in general around the 1930s, 50 years after Lung Kim got shot that started episode number 97. We now have the Chinese Nationalist Party with Chiang Kai-shek coming on, and that's happening over in China. What does that have to do here in the U.S., for example? Well, the Chinese Nationalist Party was the ruling party in mainland China from 1928 until it retreated to Taiwan in 1949 after being defeated by the Communist Party of China during the Chinese Civil War. And there was a few images and other things I found along the way during this research, and one of those was called From Chinese Heart of Texas. And in this image, there's this parade, and there's a lot of Chinese gentlemen walking around this big bowl, and across this bowl it has this sign written, "Throw all you can in the bowl of rice to save China." And the caption underneath basically describes the Onlyon Tong and the Kuomintang, or that's the other name for the Chinese Nationalist Party. These members pushed a large paper mache bowl along Avenue E toward Alamo Plaza with the sign urging onlookers to throw money into the rice bowl to help save China. This was one of the several means that were common practice for raising funds to be sent to China during its war against Japan that began in 1937. San Antonio groups raised nearly $400,000 for the cause before the war's end in 1945. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how much the Kuomintang or the Chinese National Party was into the martial arts, then I encourage you, go back to Kung Fu Podcast number 71. You can scroll down through your iTunes feed or whatever it is that you use, where we take a really close look at the Central Guashu Institute, the head of the Chinese Nationalist Party, secret police, Dai Li, and his influence as well as his interaction with the Chinese martial arts. But now let's move into a different character of history, one that we've actually brought into light here at Kung Fu Podcast. In episode 20, we talked about Lao Bun. At plumblossom.net, they write, quote, Lao Bun is credited with bringing Choli Foot into America, and that was in around 1931. This is 50 years after Tommy Lee left San Francisco to go to New York City. Lao Bun ends up in San Francisco, and in order to make money and practice in his martial arts, he joins the Hop Sing Tong, serving as a bodyguard and a gambling house bouncer guard. In the KungFuMagazine.com forum, there's an author named Jess O'Brien who wrote a book called Ne Ji Quan, Internal Martial Arts. And he wrote, quote, Sifu Wu was a Hop Sing Tong guy as a youth, and he trained with Lao Bang. I interviewed Sifu Wu for this book, and there's only a little bit about the Hop Sing Tong in this book, but Sifu Wu told me a number of hair-raising stories about collecting gambling debts with Lao Bang and other triggermen of the Tong. Apparently, San Francisco in the 1930s and 40s was a much tougher town than today, and gang wars were a common occurrence, end quote. And this is where plumblossom.net says, sometime between 1931 and 1939, he, referring to Lao Bang, established the Wah Kwang Kung Fu Club of Choli Foot, where he taught private groups and Tong members. This club later became the Hung Sing Studio of San Francisco in America. By this time, Lao Bang was already distinguished for his fighting ability and his school's lion dance proficiency, end quote. Remember, as I had mentioned earlier about the lion dancing as depicted in the 1928 silent film The Cameraman, lion dancing or dragon dancing is still performed by many of the Chinese martial arts schools as a way of demonstrating a sense of presence. And it was something that was forbidden for many schools, like, for example, in the Ip Man. I have a whole episode dedicated to lion dancing and its cultural role in Chinese martial arts schools, and that will be coming up here for you soon. There was an excellent article written by Charles Russo, Bruce Lee versus Wak Jack Man, Fact, Fiction, and the Birth of the Dragon, and it's on the Fightland blog. I'm going to share some excerpts here for you as they pertain to the Tong and the gang-like activities. It says Bruce Lee was perpetually at odds with the martial arts culture of Chinatown. There is a laundry list of little-known incidents that occurred between Bruce Lee and Chinatown martial artists dating back to when he first returned to America in the spring of 1959. Bruce learned when he got here that San Francisco's martial arts culture was different than the one he had experienced in Hong Kong as a teenager. Russo says, quote, "For about 3 decades, Chinatown's Kung Fu culture was presided over by 2 long-time Tong enforcers, Lao Bong and T.Y. Wong, whose trailblazing careers have mostly fallen into obscurity. Now, those careers have not fallen into obscurity if you're one of the members of this audience, some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world, because we look at people who have influenced the martial arts, no matter where they occurred throughout the course of history. In Hong Kong during the 1950s, Bruce Lee saw martial arts youth violence in communities, with rival martial arts schools regularly challenging each other to fights. Lao Bong opened Hung Sing in the 1930s, and with rigid student discipline, he did not allow Chinatown to turn into those same type of Hong Kong gang-like activities. There's a couple of excellent images captured where Lao Bong is standing in the center with his senior students handling weapons on both sides of him. And under the caption, it says, in 1959, an 18-year-old Bruce Lee would have a little-known run-in with this crew. Russo writes, quote, "Not long after arriving to San Francisco in 1959, Bruce Lee had a heated incident with Lao Bong and his senior students in Chinatown. When Bruce came to Hung Sing, he didn't know about San Francisco," recounts Sam Louie, one of Lao Bong's senior students at the time. "There were 7 or 8 of us in a class. He," referring to Bruce, "came down to show off his hands and tried to say that Wing Chun was the best. So our Sifu threw him out." End quote. The rest of Russo's article carries on into different accounts, but for our reference here, this was Bruce Lee's encounter with the Tong enforcer. But I want to emphasize that the historical perspective of these enforcers were similar to the original accounts that I mentioned in episode 97. The Tong were there to protect the community from rowdiness and danger and violence. As from a style perspective, Hop Sing Tong had Choli Foot well represented by Lao Bong. T.Y. Wong was his younger Tong brother, who started learning Chinese martial arts at the Central Gaoshu Institute, and then several styles of Shaolin after that. So it often fell to T.Y. to clean up the rowdy and drunken behavior around Chinatown's neighborhoods. We also have another style that got involved quite a bit, Mantis. In the 1920s, Lam Song was a young student in Hong Kong. In 1942, Lam Song immigrated to the United States and settled in Chinatown of New York City. He started teaching in Chinatown's Hakka Association, the New York Hip Sing Tong, at Pell Street. As I was doing the research for this podcast, I was reminded that my friend Ian Abernathy had a post on his website forum regarding less than legitimate black belt rankings. It was very interesting, and the responses there were too. But even for someone like myself that didn't come from a black belt system, this research and the article from the story, Bullshido.com, in October 2005, mixes these topics of organized crimes and a hocus-pocus black belt. There was a teacher named Sin Kwang The, who apparently was a Shaolin-style teacher. Now, I must admit that this has a very unusual brand because there's a gi patch that says Shaolin Do. The banner says the Karate School. Besides all these very other odd things, I'm not going to go back into all that. I'm going to try to stick to a single topic here. A student from the school, whose tag name is Shaolin Do Hero, says, quote, "I would like to say I'm not a Shaolin Do student any longer and so-called brainwashed. I do, however, have many years of knowledge about the subject. I was a student of Sin Kwang's for over 15 years. I have no ill will towards them now. I'm just trying to be clear on how I can speak on some of these matters." End quote. So, to be clear, I bring this in because this is not a critique of Sin Kwang or his history. I'm not going into all that. However, to point to this story as a way that the Chinese martial arts occasionally used organized crime as a way to demonstrate legitimate skills. So further down on this post, on around page 4, so you can imagine how much reading I've done here, a gentleman who goes under the screen name JFS USA responds to this thread, and he's referring to Sin Quan's black belt ranking, and this is dated around October the 11th, 2005. And he's discussing this topic of why Sin Quan was trying to get a black belt ranking and everything else associated with this, and this is what he writes, quote, "The people on this council were people like Ed Parker. I believe Bill Wallace was named also. Basically a group of governing black belts who wanted to try and re-rank Sin Quan. It begs the question of why Sin Quan would go before someone like Ed Parker and or Bill Wallace." JFS USA writes that Ed Parker promoted himself to the 8th Dan through his own organization at the 1972-73 Rocky Mountain Nationals, and that he was, quote, "there as both a competitor and watched it happen," end quote. Now, JFSA goes on to make a couple of opinionated statements and observations about both Parker and Wallace, but then he finishes posing this question, quote, "Why would Sin Quan go to a bunch of karate when he could have gone to the HKCMA, the Hong Kong Chinese Martial Arts Association, which was formed in 1970, or for that matter, Sin Quan could have easily gained sponsorship and subsequent membership into one of the major triads, the Hip Song Tong or Only On Tong, and that would serve as instant and virtual global standing and status," end quote. So basically he asked, why would Sin Quan want to seek outside verification and validation if he could have gone other paths inside of his own style or his own culture? Some of the old ways in the Chinese martial arts to validate oneself was through the active participation as an enforcer, a tong, a triad. And a little closer to my Kung Fu home, the Lama branch, and through its various names, was represented quite a bit in this organized crime. And Chan Tai San, who's also from this Lama branch, had this written about him by one of his longtime students in 2004. And it says, quote, "We never joined Wia Hung's federation. It was like if you had a school in New York, you were in whether you liked it or not. Real related to gang type of mentality. Then again, most of the old schools in New York City's Chinatown seem quite mixed with that political element. When we ran into Chinatown, a fee for membership was paid to a certain organization that Chan Tai San belonged to. For that reason, when we had trouble with the Vietnamese, we met with some of the leaders of that organization," end quote. Now, one day while this senior student is teaching, these members of the Vietnamese organized crime come in and they start looking for money and they start to take a few things. The senior student calls Chan Tai San and is then instructed to meet him at an unusual restaurant on a Sunday morning. This is where they're going to meet the heads of this organization. After the meeting, Chan Tai San tells the senior student, quote, "Since we paid our fee, they'd take care of our trouble." Then one of the two old guys from this organization tells the senior student, "This guy, he's good with the meat cleaver, and this other guy has a gun." Ma Sigung Harry Ying taught the Lama-style system, which was also known as Hop Gar, and depending upon how you hear the story, it was either changed by Young Lum or it was changed shortly thereafter. Harry Ying had learned it from him. But either way, Harry Ying was involved in parts of the organized crime, and it's what led to him being gunned down in front of his house. The San Francisco paperman Tom Imch wrote this article dated Sunday, November the 15th, 2009, and the name of the article is called The Chinatown Murders. The article is going to be referring to a San Francisco street gang called the Hua Ching, which was basically described as a group of youth who had been foreign-born, who had come in from China, primarily from Hong Kong, and when they arrived, they became enrolled and indoctrinated into the Hua Ching. And so here's what Mr. Imch, the San Francisco paperman, wrote about Ma Sigung Harry Ying. Quote, "The leadership of the Hua Ching specifically is known to have strong Hong Kong ties, now under investigation by the Royal Hong Kong Police, as well as ties to the underworld gangs in Los Angeles and to an organization in New York's Chinatown known as the White Eagles. Harry Ying, murdered in his Kung Fu studio March 13, 1972, is believed to have been a courier between the Hua Qings and a mysterious person in Hong Kong known only by a code name. Ng, gunned down on Monday, had airline reservations for Hong Kong the following Saturday. The 60-year-old Ng was sometimes known as the Professor, and police say he was the mentor of the Hua Qing thugs, teaching them extortion tactics. The criminal activities of the Chinatown gangs, the extortion racket, assault, and armed robbery, for the most part, are all well known to the police, particularly to the homicide and intelligence details." End quote. And a little further down in the article, Mr. Imps writes, quote, "In the period between early 1968 and the murder of Hua Qing leader Glenn Fong in the March of 1970, it was the Professor, Harry Ng, police believe, who organized the Hong Kong kids into extortion gangs, acting as a teacher, much like the character Fa Jin in the London of Charles Dickens." End quote. So there are plenty of ties between these Kung Fu styles and systems and the Tongs, gangs, and Triads as they carried out their business of organized crime. So in summary, the secret societies like the Triads and Tongs brought with them, as part of their culture, the Chinese martial arts. They even used it as a front for business, recruitment, and training. In most instances, with the emergence of the Tongs and the Triads, they were secret societies that carried out operations to circumvent oppression, support justice, and maintain a sense of culture. At these early moments, martial skills were an essential part of the Tong. Protective martial arts skills, weapons, and strategies were prevalent all throughout the Tongs, Triads, and gang practices. Later, the Tong would associate themselves with the gang, a street-level extension of the Tong, and they were also there to help protect the community. It wasn't until later that these organizations became more criminal in their associations and in their actions. In fact, take the December 12, 1988 article from New York Times and author Barbara Basler, where she describes a 10-year-old being sworn into the Triad on a rooftop in Hong Kong. 11 people were initiated that night, and each had to have their finger pricked, squeeze the blood into a cup, and then the blood was mixed with water, and they all had to drink from this cup as part of this long ceremony. And she writes, quote, "Triads trace their roots back to 17th century China, and although they call their leaders by traditional titles such as White Paper Fan and Red Pole, they dominate many of the rough and tumble criminal businesses in modern Hong Kong." End quote. In this article, Mrs. Basler will tell you that these criminal gangs are involved in activities such as, quote, loan sharking, illegal drug sales, pornography, and prostitution. Triads have virtually taken over the home contracting business here and even control which buses are allowed to operate along some of Hong Kong's busiest streets. End quote. Brian Merritt, Chief Staff Officer of the Police Organized and Serious Crime Group, says, quote, "If a restaurant owner won't pay up the first time, the next day the triad will come in at the busiest hour and 50 triad thugs will spread out and take up all the tables. If a nightclub don't pay, they like to toss live snakes onto the dance floor." Triad gangs control many of the colony's popular martial arts schools, provide most of the bouncers for nightclubs, and many of the extras in Hong Kong Kung Fu movies. But the big Kung Fu stars here are straight, but a lot of the extras are Triad members. They are the ones who practice martial arts in big numbers, end quotes. If you're interested in furthering research in that area, I can recommend Gods, Ghosts, and Gangsters by Avram Boretz. I have referenced this work before when we discussed Lung Kai's ghost story, but part of the description in this book says, quote, "Based on the field work in China and Taiwan spanning nearly 2 decades, Gods, Ghosts, and Gangsters offers a thorough and original account of violent ritual and ritual violence in Chinese religion and society. Close-up, sensitive portrayals and the voices of ritual actors themselves, mostly working-class men, many of them members of sworn brotherhoods and gangs, convincingly link martial ritual practice to the lives and desires of men on the margins of Chinese society." End quote. So as we walk through a timeline starting in 1850, closing it up at around 1960s. That's over 100 years of early Chinese martial arts and secret societies as they appeared here in the United States. We looked at the cultural and political landscape that brutally marginalized these Chinese immigrants and forced them to move across the country. One of the underlying components of this story that really got my attention is how much of the Chinese culture was nearly bred out. You take thousands of Chinese men for every Chinese woman, and you force cross-cultural development, requiring these new families to either lose or blend their Chinese culture. I also noted that these Chinese martial arts schools were blended right into the environment, right into the landscape. Grocery store on the first floor, martial arts on the second, and your dentist is on the third. It was so organically blended you could almost miss it. And I'm going to close this podcast with a quote from my good friend Dr. Ben Judkins over at Kung Fu Tea. You can get to his website by going to kungfupodcast.com/Ben. He wrote an article dated November 21st, 2014, and it was titled Social Distrust in the Chinese Martial Arts, and I'll probably bring more of this to you later. But he wrote, quote, "When looking at the lives of specific individuals, it is not hard to guess why some in the local community distrusted martial artists. These figures were often aligned with various tongs, and they performed a wide range of services, including the provision of security, collection of gambling debts, and the training of other enforcers. Are such activities the root of the often mentioned but seldom explored distrust of martial artists within Chinese society? I have been mulling over this basic question for the last couple of days. I suspect that social attitudes towards the martial artists are both more nuanced and varied than one might expect. In general, one can say that Kung Fu clans operate under something of a social cloud, yet the shape of that cloud and the reason for its formation vary by both geography and time. By delving deeper into the varieties of distrust that have been recorded in the literature, we might gain some insight into the ways in which the traditional arts have interacted with different aspects of Chinese popular culture." End quote. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. I really do appreciate you joining me for the third and final chapter of the secret societies in Chinese martial arts. There was more to this podcast, but I'm going to save it for a future release. Episode number 100 is organized, and then it's going to be recorded very soon, where we're going to be taking a look into Taekwondo, a killing art, a historical, political, economical, and journalistic research project. You will not want to miss it. Promise. I appreciate your support. If you find value in the program, go to kungfupodcast.com/support.